Well, good morning, everybody. Today I would like to discuss with you the rebuilding of a Corvair late model rear wheel spindle and bearing housing. Rebuilding this is not as easy as it might seem. General Motors has pointed out a number of methods of taking the unit apart, and I'd like to review a method of putting it back together, which will save a number of steps and make your life a whole lot more easy. This is the actual photograph inside of the General Motors manual that shows you how to measure the bearing end play inside the carrier once you've installed new bearings and what it takes to set it all up. This drawing shows how you have to pull the actual spindle out of the bearing to separate the entire mechanism. This drawing shows you how to separate the actual universal joint flange from the spindle, all of which is an entire big undertaking. They're all press fit. It's not an easy job. So once you get this thing apart, putting it back together and finding it not exactly the way it should be, you'd have to go through this entire exercise all over again. So let's talk about exactly what we're going to do to remedy this problem. In this view, you can see all of the components that make up the rear bearing carrier assembly. So here's what we're going to do to simplify the assembly method and the method of checking the end play that you have between the bearings and the inner races on the rear carrier. So we have a precision block. It's 1 inch by 2 inch by 3 inches. It's commonly called a 1-2-3 block. On top of the 1-2-3 block, we're going to install the outer bearing assembly. From there, we will install the rear carrier assembly. The rear carrier assembly has brand new races installed already. This is the outer bearing assembly. Put that inside the carrier, and now we will install our 1-2-3 block on top of that bearing assembly, and I'm going to move the camera so we can see exactly what happens next. Okay, now what we're going to be doing here is we're measuring the distance from one bearing to the other without any end play. It has no end play because the bearings are actually seated in the races the way they are right now. So we'll bring down the height gauge, and we're looking for a number. That number is 98. Can everybody see the 98? Okay. Keep that number in mind. The actual dimension doesn't really matter too very much what the dimension is. What you're looking for is the number. It says 98. So now we're going to disassemble this entire system, and we're going to do it one more time. Okay. Remove the height gauge out of the way. Remove the 1-2-3 block. We remove the outer bearing. We put in the inner sleeve assembly. Get that in position correctly. We're going to put in the precision spacer, which makes up or creates the end play for this assembly. We now add in the outer bearing assembly, replace the 1-2-3 block, and now we come across and we're going to look again now to see exactly what that number was. The original number was 98. Now we have, let's say, 104. Does everybody see 104 here on the indicator? Okay. Now, we had 98. We have 104 now. That means that there is 6 thousandths clearance now between the inner races and the bearings, which is actually okay. General Motors will allow you between 1 and 6 thousandths of an inch. But 6 thousandths of an inch is exactly what we have now. I find that to be excessive. Let's see if we can do better. So now what we'll do is we'll remove the assembly, remove the 1, 2, 3 block, remove the bearing, remove the precision spacer. Now we're going to put in the machine spacer that's required to get this assembly into the position that I feel is far superior than having it on the absolute end of the spectrum. So now we can come across here now and we can see we have 0. Does everybody see that? Let me come across here. All right. We got 0 on the height gauge. Now you have, let's say, 2/1000ths of an inch clearance between the bearings and the inner races of the carrier assembly. General Motors is calling for 1/1000th of an inch to a maximum of 6/1000ths of an inch. Now you have 2/1000ths of an inch, which I find is to be far superior. The reason why I do this is because you can actually correct the end play on the surface plate. You don't have to assemble the entire thing in the car, put all the pieces in. All of these assemblies are press fit. So that basically means that when you take it apart, you're pressing the bearings on, off, on, off. You got to take the outer flange off. That's not an easy exercise. You can do this entire assembly on the surface plate in the amount of time that it's shown here that I've done it. That might be a maximum of 10 minutes. It's far better for you to take this entire assembly down to the machine shop, let them machine these spaces. You need a surface grinder to be able to get them correct. The componentry is hardened steel, so therefore it must be done with a surface grinder. And once you get it done, you can assemble the entire flange and the spindle, and you'll have exactly the clearance you need without having to take it apart again. So I hope you enjoyed this exercise today. It's a little bit far more simple for you guys to set up the end play on the surface plate than it is to take it apart and put it back together. And I don't know, I just enjoy it better this way. I'm a mechanical kind of guy. It makes a whole lot more sense to me. I hope it makes sense to you. Thanks very much for joining us today. We'll see you again next time for another rebuild. Bye-bye. Well, here we are back in the final frame, and there's been some discussion as to whether or not the actual hardened steel collar and the spacer would crush when the nut is torqued on the back of the spindle. Well, if that were true, then the collar would crush. If the collar actually crushes, then the bearing would actually distort, because the bearing and the collar and the spacer are of the same hardness. So here you see the indicator is zeroed, and I'm going to show you the backlash that we had initially set in. There you have it, 2/1000ths backlash, just as before. In this shot, you can actually see the actual 2/1000ths clearance and what it means when I spin the rotor. If the bearing and the race were in direct contact, this rotor would not spin as freely as it does. So therefore, this method is quite viable, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much. See you next time. Bye-bye.